Welcome to today's video. Today, we will dive into one of the most shocking cases of racial discrimination that sparked the civil rights movement for African Americans in the United States. The case of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African American teenager, became a symbol of brutality and injustice. And even today, it remains a powerful reminder of the consequences of racism. Till's story is not only a personal tragedy but also a pivotal moment in American history. Emmett Lewis Till, a 14-year-old boy, was part of the Till family in Chicago, Illinois. He was the only son of Mamie Till, a strong, resilient, and determined woman. Despite being born into a family that wasn't wealthy, Mamie poured all her love and care into raising Emmett, teaching him essential life lessons. Mamie always encouraged her son to live a hopeful life, to rise above the difficulties life threw at him, especially during a dark time in America when racial segregation was deeply ingrained in society. Emmett, though only 14, had a very distinct personality. He was cheerful, always laughing, and had a knack for telling jokes that made those around him laugh. His friends and family adored him for his humor and kindness. However, in that era, Emmett couldn't escape the barriers of racial discrimination, even though he was raised in a city like Chicago, which could be considered a more diverse environment. Emmett still had to face prejudice, especially as he entered adolescence and began to realize more clearly the differences in how people of different races were treated in society. In the 1950s, America, particularly the southern states, was still under the dominance of Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation. Black people had to live under a rigid system of rules that applied separate facilities and rights for black and white people. In the South, these laws were not just words on paper but were reinforced daily by violence, intimidation, and the social structure that marginalized black people at every turn. The tension was palpable, and the unjust treatment of black individuals was a constant in the daily life of millions across the country. For Emmett, life in Chicago may have seemed more progressive, but even in the North, discrimination was never far behind. Racial prejudice was still pervasive, and it was especially hard for African American teenagers like Emmett to navigate this world without encountering racism. This stark division between races created a sharp contrast in Emmett's understanding of how people of different races were supposed to behave toward each other, and what would happen when these unspoken rules were broken. This tension and fear were amplified in the Deep South, where Mississippi, the state where Emmett traveled to in the summer of 1955, was one of the most entrenched regions of racism and segregation. The community in Money, Mississippi, was an entirely different world from the one Emmett knew in Chicago. The rules were stricter, and the danger more immediate for someone like Emmett, a black teenager from the North, who wasn't accustomed to the ever-present racial boundaries of the South. What he didn't know was that his visit to Mississippi would soon change the course of history. Emmett Till's story would become a chilling reminder of how deep the divisions of race ran in America. How the simple act of being black in the South could become a life or death matter. In the summer of 1955, after finishing the school year, Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till, decided that he would visit Money, Mississippi, the place where Mamie had grown up. This trip was part of the family's plan to reconnect with relatives and create lasting memories together. For Emmett, although he was still a teenager, the trip represented an opportunity to explore a new land, vastly different from the lively, modern world of Chicago. He was eager and excited, unaware that this journey would forever change not only his life but also the course of an entire nation. Mississippi, where Emmett traveled to, was a state infamous for its severe racial segregation. It was a place where African Americans lived under harsh conditions and endured blatant discrimination by white people. In the South, black people did not enjoy the same freedoms as they did in the North, and they were often looked down upon, threatened, and oppressed by those in power. People like Emmett, even as children, had to face this disparity directly and painfully. For Emmett, the trip to Mississippi was an eye-opening experience. The atmosphere in Money, a small, rural town, felt alien and somewhat intimidating to a boy who had grown up in the relatively progressive environment of Chicago. In Chicago, Emmett could play freely with friends, participate in activities, and enjoy a sense of safety and equality that wasn't even remotely possible in Mississippi. While Emmett was aware of the existence of racial discrimination, He did not fully grasp the extent of the animosity and danger that existed in the Deep South. To him, it was just another trip to visit relatives, a chance to have some fun and explore a different way of life. But Mississippi was not like Chicago. As soon as he arrived, Emmett was hit by a stark realization that the segregation here was not just institutional, it was felt in every look, every gesture, and every interaction. The open, visible animosity was not just something spoken about in hushed tones, it was lived and breathed every day by the people around him. In this small town, the laws of Jim Crow were not just enforced, they were lived realities that permeated even the most basic human interactions. Emmett, still young and full of curiosity, probably did not fully appreciate the dangers of being an African American in such a volatile environment. He had never experienced firsthand the oppressive atmosphere of the South, nor had he ever been made to feel like a second-class citizen based on the color of his skin. However, this journey to Mississippi would soon bring him face to face with the very brutality and racism that defined life for Black Americans in the South. The sense of freedom and innocence Emmett had grown up with was about to be stripped away, as his trip to Mississippi would culminate in a tragic event that would forever change the history of the civil rights movement in America. On that day, under the scorching sun of a southern afternoon, Emmett Till walked into Carolyn Bryant's grocery store with the innocent curiosity of a 14-year-old boy. He was just a kid from Chicago, a big city where racial discrimination, though still prevalent, wasn't as harsh or as deeply ingrained as it was in the southern states. Emmett, being a charming and lively boy, had no understanding of the unwritten rules that governed the relationship between white and black people in the American South during the 1950s. Especially in Mississippi. At that time, the South was living under the oppressive rule of the Jim Crow laws, rigid and harsh segregation laws that dictated nearly every aspect of daily life. These laws, although not always written explicitly, controlled almost every facet of the social order, from how black people were supposed to behave when encountering white people, to the nature of their interactions and relationships. In this environment, a black man, or even a black teenager like Emmett, was expected to know his place. If he didn't show enough deference or if his actions were perceived as disrespectful, he could easily be accused of trespassing on the white world. The consequences of such an accusation were severe, ranging from imprisonment and beatings to, in the worst cases, death. In this context, any behavior from Emmett, even something as innocent as a playful joke, could be easily misinterpreted or exaggerated into an act of sexual harassment, something that, in the South at that time, could be met with violent and fatal consequences. When Emmett entered Bryant's store, he was likely just doing what any curious teenager would do, chatting with someone who was close in age. Maybe even trying to impress the store clerk with his humor or youthful energy. He might have smiled, made a playful comment, or perhaps even flirted in the way that young boys do. But he couldn't know that in Mississippi, a black boy's behavior, no matter how innocent, was scrutinized through a completely different lens. Carolyn Bryant, the white woman who owned the store, claimed that Emmett had acted inappropriately. She said that he had made an indecent proposal, which was a phrase used to describe any behavior from a black person toward a white person that was perceived as impertinent or disrespectful. The exact nature of the encounter remains a mystery to this day, as there were no witnesses who could back up Bryant's version of events. And Emmett himself was never given the chance to explain. It's important to understand the power dynamics at play in the segregated South. The word of a white person was automatically assumed to be more credible than that of a black person. This meant that a false accusation, even one made by someone with no evidence to support it, could be enough to condemn a black individual. Emmett Till, a young boy full of life and unaware of the extreme dangers he was walking into, had just become the target of a society that treated him as inferior and subhuman. Bryant's accusation sent shockwaves through the small town of Money, Mississippi. The following days would bring a terrifying chain of events that would leave Emmett's life hanging by a thread. What had started as an innocent interaction in a grocery store would soon spiral into a nightmare of brutality and injustice, setting in motion a tragedy that would not only end Emmett Till's life but also ignite a movement for justice and equality that would change the course of history. The feeling of violation that Mrs. Carolyn Bryant attributed to Emmett Till quickly escalated into a serious accusation. Shortly after the incident, she reported what had happened to her husband, Roy Bryant, and her brother-in-law, J.W. Milam. Both men, white and steeped in the entrenched belief in white supremacy, saw themselves as protectors of their racial dominance. To them, the accusation made by Bryant, despite the complete lack of evidence, was enough to take matters into their own hands. In the racially segregated South, such allegations were often viewed as absolute truths, and this would have serious and dangerous consequences for any black person, especially a teenager like Emmett. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, fueled by anger and a deep sense of affront, decided to punish Emmett for supposedly crossing the lines that were rigidly enforced between black and white people in the South. In their minds, this wasn't just about defending the honor of a white woman. It was about asserting their racial dominance and ensuring that any black person who dared to step out of line would be met with severe retribution. The status quo of white supremacy in the South demanded it. They saw themselves as enforcers of these racial boundaries. And Emmett, in their eyes, had crossed a line that no black person should ever dare to cross. As news of the accusation spread through the community, not just in Mississippi, but across the South, a wave of outrage and fear began to rise. In a society where racial hierarchies were deeply embedded, and where white power was omnipresent, black people were accustomed to living in a constant state of fear of being accused, humiliated, or punished for even the slightest perceived disrespect. Emmett's case was no different. But what made it particularly horrific was that the accusation, based solely on the word of a white woman, was enough to ignite a chain of events that would alter the course of history. The community's reaction was swift and intense. For many black people in Mississippi and beyond, the news of Emmett's alleged crime was a chilling reminder of how fragile their lives were. They were all too aware that in the eyes of the law and society, their existence was constantly under threat, and the false accusations against Emmett could easily have been their own fate. For many white people, however, the accusation against a black teenager was something that had to be defended and upheld, regardless of the truth. As this news spread, it stirred fear, but also anger and a sense of injustice, especially among African Americans who had long suffered under the brutal weight of the Jim Crow system. Emmett's case began to take on a larger meaning, a symbol of the oppression and injustice that black people faced every day. The impact was felt far beyond Mississippi, and it was clear that this was not just the story of one boy's tragic fate. It was a reflection of the larger social disease of racism that plagued the country. In the coming days and weeks, what would unfold in Mississippi would become a flashpoint in the fight for civil rights and racial justice. But at this moment, for Emmett Till, the odds were already stacked against him. He had no way of knowing that his innocence would be overshadowed by a system so deeply entrenched in racial hatred and injustice. On the night of August 28, 1955, a dark and chilling evening in Mississippi, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, two white men from the town, arrived at the home of Mose Wright, Emmett Till's uncle, where the young boy was staying. Bryant and Milam were notorious for their violent temperaments, living in a region infamous for its entrenched racial segregation and the absolute power that white people held over the lives of African Americans. In stark contrast to Emmett's peaceful life, these men symbolized all the cruelty and injustice of the oppressive system of white supremacy. Without warning, they barged into the small house, shouting commands and demanding that Emmett follow them. The sound of shouting and chaos filled Mose Wright's humble home as Emmett, who had never experienced anything like this before, stood frozen in fear, not understanding what was happening. He was just a 14-year-old boy, clueless that his life would be irrevocably changed in this very moment. "Come with us," Roy Bryant shouted, his voice booming through the house. Emmett, stammering and confused, had no idea what was going on. But before he could react, Milam grabbed him roughly by the arm. At that moment, all Emmett could feel was an overwhelming sense of helplessness and terror rising in his chest. He had no way to resist. With brute force and unrelenting cruelty, the two white men dragged him out of Mose Wright's home, showing no mercy, no empathy. They ignored the desperate pleas of his uncle, who begged them to release the boy. In that agonizing moment, Emmett's world shifted from one of innocence and curiosity to one of unimaginable fear and confusion. The teenager, who had just been trying to enjoy a summer visit to relatives, was now at the mercy of two men who viewed him as less than human, as an object to be punished. The stark contrast between the child Emmett was and the brutal reality he was about to face could not have been more jarring. The harshness of their actions, the speed with which they ripped him from his home, illustrated not only their hatred of him but also the larger societal system that allowed such things to happen without remorse. This was not just a kidnapping, this was a deeply ingrained part of a violent and oppressive system that saw black lives as expendable. Emmett, unknowing, was now caught in the deadly machinery of racial hatred. What was about to happen to him was not just about two men acting out of personal vendetta. It was a manifestation of the racist justice that prevailed in the Deep South at that time. As the night stretched on, Emmett's fate was sealed. No one could have foreseen the terror that would unfold in those dark, silent hours that followed. After abducting Emmett Till, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam had no intention of letting the young boy survive. In the cover of the dark, they took Emmett to a secluded area, far away from any prying eyes, where no one would hear his screams or pleas for help. It was here that they began their brutal assault on him. They punched and kicked Emmett mercilessly, striking him in the face, chest, and stomach. Each blow not only caused excruciating pain but also disfigured his innocent face. It was not enough to physically harm him, they also humiliated him with crude, derogatory words, stripping him of his dignity simply because of the color of his skin. When they had beaten him to the point where he could barely stand, they shot Emmett in the head, ending his life in an instant. But the horror didn't end there. They discarded his lifeless body into the Tallahatchie River, tying a heavy metal fan to his neck to ensure his body would sink and never be found, at least not easily. This wasn't just a simple murder, it was a gruesome, calculated act of cruelty meant to send a chilling message about the power of white supremacy. It was a grotesque statement that the lives of black people, especially those who dared to step outside their prescribed role in society, meant nothing. This act of savagery, both in its brutality and its inhumanity, reverberated through the African American community and even among some white individuals with a conscience. The death of Emmett Till was not just the end of an innocent child, it was a horrific assertion of control. A stark reminder of the brutal reality of racial inequality and white dominance. In a society that claimed to be built on justice, this was a stark contradiction, a reminder that, in the eyes of many, black lives were not considered valuable. Emmett's death was not an isolated incident, it was part of the larger system of racial oppression that permeated the South, where the very act of being black could cost someone their life. The callousness with which his murder was carried out and the disrespect for his humanity was a direct challenge to the dignity of all black people. It wasn't just a boy who was murdered, it was an entire community's sense of justice and humanity that was assaulted. On August 31, 1955, after 3 days of being missing, the body of Emmett Till was discovered in the Tallahatchie River. When his body was pulled from the water, it was unrecognizable. His face had been so brutally beaten that it was impossible to identify him by appearance. And his body was covered with horrific wounds. The only detail that helped identify him was the ring he had been wearing. A small but powerful reminder of his youth and the life he had been robbed of. With grief, outrage, and an unwavering demand for justice, Emmett's family, particularly his mother, Mamie Till, insisted on a proper forensic examination and a fair investigation. Mamie, a woman of immense strength, understood the deeply ingrained racial injustice of the South at the time. She knew that justice for a black child was almost unattainable in such a system. But she was resolute. She demanded that her son's death be publicly acknowledged in all its brutality. Despite knowing the risks and criticism she would face for allowing the public to witness such an awful sight, she believed that exposing the horror of Emmett's death was the only way to draw national attention to the cruelty and the urgent need for change. Mamie Till made the brave decision to hold an open casket funeral, allowing the public and the media to see the full extent of what had been done to her son. When the casket was opened, the attendees were confronted with the ghastly evidence of the violence Emmett had endured. His body was unrecognizable, battered beyond belief, and the shock of the images sent a wave of horror across the nation. Photographs of Emmett's disfigured body were published in newspapers and magazines, and they quickly spread across the country. The images of his mutilated face, published in places like Jet magazine, sparked widespread outrage and grief. They were more than just disturbing images, they were a stark and undeniable call to action. The photos shocked the American public, especially the black community, who were already living with the pain of systemic racism and violence. The images of Emmett Till's disfigured body were a catalyst, igniting a wave of national outrage that could no longer be ignored. In cities across the United States, the death of Emmett Till became a rallying cry for justice. It brought into sharp focus the brutal realities of racial violence in the South and fueled a growing demand for civil rights and equal treatment under the law. For many, this was the moment when the civil rights movement was no longer just an abstract idea but a deeply personal and urgent cause. The public outrage over Emmett Till's death sparked a wave of protests, and his story became a symbol of the fight for justice for Black Americans. Mamie Till, in her strength and dignity, had forced the nation to reckon with the consequences of racial hatred. Though the battle for justice for Emmett had only just begun, the impact of his death would resonate throughout American society for years to come. His legacy would be carried forward by those who stood up against the oppression he had suffered. And his story would become an indelible part of the struggle for civil rights. The discovery of Emmett Till's body on August 31, 1955, was a devastating shock to his family, especially to his mother, Mamie Till. She could hardly comprehend that her beloved son had endured such a brutal and merciless death. But Mamie Till refused to succumb to silence. She was determined not to allow the forces that had taken her son's life to go unchallenged. Mamie Till made the bold decision to demand a public investigation and insisted on bringing her son's body back to Chicago for a proper funeral. However, she also made a pivotal decision that would have lasting consequences not only for this case but for the entire civil rights movement in America. She chose to have her son's open casket funeral, allowing the public to see the horrors that had been inflicted upon him. "Not everyone will believe me, but they will believe what they see," Mamie Till famously said when deciding to let her son's body be displayed. This was an act of courage and dramatic defiance, but also one rooted in profound humanity. She wanted the world to witness the brutal violence Emmett had endured. The images of his body, so horribly disfigured from beatings and a gunshot wound, were impossible for anyone to look at without being shaken to their core. The open casket of Emmett Till became a national shockwave, especially in the North, where Mamie lived. The heart-wrenching images from the funeral captured the attention of the media and spread rapidly across the United States. This was not just a mother mourning her son. It was a powerful statement to the world about the cruelty of racial violence and the urgent need for justice. The graphic photographs from the funeral were published in Jet magazine and widely circulated. These images became an emotional rallying cry for many, especially in the Black community. But they also reached a broader audience. The images were a stark, visual confrontation with the extreme consequences of racism in the American South. People who had previously been unaware or passive to the realities of racial injustice were now being forced to reckon with it in a very direct, personal way. Mamie Till's courageous decision to allow the world to see her son's brutalized body became a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, fueling the outrage that would soon spread across the nation and galvanizing efforts to confront and dismantle the systemic racism that permeated American society at the time. Emmett's death, and the public outcry that followed, would be one of the key events that propelled the civil rights movement forward, inspiring future leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. to continue the fight for equality and justice. In September 1955, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, the two white men accused of killing Emmett Till, faced trial in a court in Sumner, Mississippi. However, it quickly became clear that there was no chance for a fair trial for Emmett Till within the Southern justice system at the time. The trial was held with an all-white jury, which meant that the defendants were virtually guaranteed to be acquitted. The reason for this was simple. In the South during that period, white people held absolute dominance in every aspect of society, politically, socially, and legally. The justice system was not only racially discriminatory, but also expressed a contemptuous attitude towards anyone who dared challenge white authority. The defense attorneys for Bryant and Milam wasted no time presenting arguments aimed at minimizing the guilt of the defendants. They relied on vague and flawed reasoning, deliberately ignoring the clear evidence of the brutality of the crime. They claimed that Emmett Till had sexually harassed Carolyn Bryant, despite there being no evidence to support this accusation. They even went so far as to blame Till for provoking his own murder, even though, in reality, a 14-year-old boy could not possibly pose a threat to two grown men like Bryant and Milam. The defense played on the deep-seated racist attitudes of the time, arguing that Emmett's very presence in a white area was an affront to the racial hierarchy they sought to uphold. In a deeply segregated society like the South, even the mere interaction of a black person with a white person, especially a young black boy speaking to or allegedly flirting with a white woman, was seen as an act of defiance against the rigid racial boundaries of the time. The trial lasted only a few days, and by September 23, 1955, the all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict for both Bryant and Milam. The jury deliberated for just over an hour, a clear indication that they had no intention of holding the two men accountable for the horrific crime. The trial was a painful and stark reminder of the deep-rooted racial injustice in the South, where even the most blatant acts of violence against black people could be dismissed with impunity. The acquittal of Bryant and Milam sparked outrage, not just among the black community but among many others who were appalled by the miscarriage of justice. For many, this case became a defining moment in the fight for civil rights, as it highlighted the stark contrasts between the legal system's treatment of white perpetrators and black victims. The trial and its outcome were widely covered in the media, and it fueled anger and frustration across the country, particularly among African Americans, who were already fighting against the pervasive system of racial inequality. Rosa Parks, who would famously refuse to give up her seat on a segregated bus later that year, cited Emmett Till's murder as a key turning point that motivated her to take a stand. The Till case was thus one of the catalysts for the broader civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. After the not guilty verdict of the jury, public opinion in the United States was shaken to its core. The black community, especially those involved in the civil rights movement, could not remain silent in the face of such blatant injustice. The verdict sparked a wave of anger and disappointment. It wasn't just black people who were outraged. A significant portion of white people, particularly in the North, began to recognize that the Southern legal system was not only an unjust mechanism but also a powerful tool used to uphold oppression. The case of Emmett Till was not just the death of a young boy, it became a symbol of brutality and injustice. The image of Emmett, particularly the photograph of Mamie Till sitting next to her son in the open casket, stirred the conscience of millions of Americans. This act of exposing the horrific violence Emmett had endured was a pivotal moment, awakening the public to the deep racial inequalities that still plagued the nation. This event sparked a stronger wave of anti-racism activism, contributing significantly to the rise of the civil rights movement in America. The movement gained momentum, with protests, campaigns, and actions advocating for the rights of black people. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and other leaders found inspiration in Emmett Till's death as they continued their fight for justice and equality. The Emmett Till case became a historical turning point in the struggle against racial discrimination in the U.S., a story that could never be forgotten, forever etched in the minds of those fighting for a more just society. Till's tragic death and the subsequent trial became a defining moment, illustrating the deep racial divide and the pressing need for social change. It is a reminder that even in the face of systemic injustice, the courage of individuals like Mamie Till and the collective will of those who stood up for equality could spark profound societal transformation. The Emmett Till case was not just a family tragedy, it became a defining moment in the history of the United States. The death of Emmett, an innocent black teenager, highlighted the glaring racial discrimination within both the American legal system and society at large. Mamie Till, with her resolute decision to have her son's casket displayed in an open viewing, sparked a powerful wave of emotion across the country, especially when Emmett's mutilated and unrecognizable body was revealed. This image forced millions of Americans, including many white people, to confront the brutal reality of what black people were enduring in a racially segregated society. The cruelty Emmett suffered was no longer just the tragedy of one family, it became a national issue. Those who had remained silent or avoided addressing the problem of racial discrimination could no longer turn a blind eye. The image of Emmett, no longer the innocent, smiling boy, but now a symbol of brutality and injustice, awakened the empathy of millions. His story resonated not just in the South but across the entire United States. His death marked the moment when the true horror of racial violence was laid bare for all to see. The Emmett Till case became a powerful catalyst for the civil rights movement in the United States. In particular, after Emmett's death, the fight for black civil rights gained significant momentum. Despite the indifference of the authorities and society at the time toward the blatant crimes, this case inspired many to rise up against injustice. Rosa Parks, a black woman, became famous just a few months after Emmett Till's murder when she refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. On December 1, 1955, her act of defiance, along with subsequent large-scale protests, sparked the racial equality movement. Alongside her, Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a strong leader of the civil rights movement, calling for equality and justice for all people, regardless of race. The civil rights movement was further propelled by events like the Emmett Till case. And over time, the rights of black Americans began to be brought into the spotlight, laying the groundwork for deep societal changes in America. Although Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were never punished, the Emmett Till case left an indelible legacy in American society. What followed the case was not only a call for justice but also a stark reminder of the profound injustices embedded within the legal system and society. The case served as a rallying point for those demanding change and equality, underscoring the ongoing struggle for civil rights in the United States.